Hi there. I'm glad you're here. Tonight's story may surprise you, but before we begin, I'd like to ask you to gently tap the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. These little gestures help this channel keep going. Also, if you don't mind, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Which corner of the world do you call home? I read every reply, and it's incredible to see how far these quiet stories reach. Now close your eyes if you'd like. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the world fade just a bit. Because what you're about to hear may sound like history, but it also has shadows. This is the story of healing, or rather what healing meant to the ancient Greeks, and why sometimes it was more terrifying than the illness itself. Let's begin. Long before modern hospitals with sterile hallways and IV drips, there were temples. White stone sanctuaries carved into hillsides, shaded by olive groves and kissed by sea winds. These were the Asclepius sacred healing centers, dedicated to the god Asclepius, the deity of medicine. At first glance, they were peaceful. Birds sang in cypress trees. Marble statues stood in silent vigil. Pilgrims whispered prayers while pouring libations on smooth altars. But beneath that calm exterior, something older stirred. These were not hospitals in the sense we know them today. They were spiritual theaters where the sick didn't just seek a cure. They sought favor, they sought omens, and sometimes they found nightmares. Imagine arriving at one of these temples. You've traveled for days, weak from fever or limping from a festering wound. You pass under columns etched with symbols you barely understand. Priests greet you, not doctors, but keepers of ritual. You're asked to cleanse yourself in a sacred spring, not for hygiene, but for spiritual purification. You're not here to be examined, you're here to be judged. Then begins the ritual of incubation. You're led to a darkened room, sometimes a cave, sometimes a long dormitory where dozens of others lie moaning, waiting. You're instructed to lie down and sleep on a straw mat. The priests whisper prayers over you. Incense thickens the air. The night begins. You're told that Asclepius will visit you in your dreams. That healing will come not from herbs or hands, but from visions. But what no one tells you is what those dreams might hold. As the night deepens, the temple quiets. You lie still, heart pounding. You hear rustling snakes, sacred to Asclepius, slither across the floor. They're not dangerous, they say. They are the god's emissaries. Their touch is divine. But your mind, half lost to fever, doesn't know the difference between divine and dreadful. You fall asleep if sleep comes. And the dreams begin. Some dream of the god himself, tall, bearded, gentle, placing a hand upon a wound. Others dream of strange symbols, of rivers of blood, of death. Some wake healed, some wake screaming, and some do not wake at all. In the morning, the priests gather the dreamers. They interpret what was seen. If your vision pleased the god, you're allowed to stay. If not, you're sent away. Sometimes with a charm, sometimes with a curse. The sick were not just patients here. They were participants in a mystery. The line between healing and haunting was paper thin. And always, the temple watched. But it wasn't just dreams that made these places terrifying. It was the lack of understanding, the uncertainty, the power imbalance. The patients had no voice, no second opinion. What the priest said stood. If he declared your sickness the result of impiety, you repented. If he blamed the wrath of a dead relative, you offered gifts. The body was not separate from the soul, it was a reflection of it. And so healing required more than medicine. It required sacrifice. And sometimes, those sacrifices weren't symbolic. In some sanctuaries, animals were bled beneath the moon. In others, the sick were isolated, forced to fast, to hallucinate. And the more desperate they became, the more easily the priests shaped their minds. These temples were places of beauty, yes, but also of control. And for many, fear. Fear of failure. Fear of being turned away. Fear of what might crawl across the floor when the lights went out. Tonight we begin this journey into the chambers of the Asclepia, into the minds of those who dreamed, into the shadowy space where faith and fear met on the stone floor of a sacred room, and where healing, if it came, always came at a price. Let your breath soften. Let your thoughts drift. We've only just begun. They say the first healing temple of Asclepius stood at Epidaurus, a quiet sanctuary nestled between gentle hills in the northeastern Peloponnese. The land itself was sacred, bathed in wind and cicada song, kissed by sunlight that filtered softly through olive branches. But long before marble columns rose, before chants echoed through corridors, there were stories, old stories. Tales of a mortal man named Asclepius, taught by the centaur Chiron, who learned not only how to mend wounds but how to bring the dead back to life. Such knowledge was a threat. The gods grew uneasy. Life and death, they believed, must remain in balance. And so, as myth tells it, Zeus struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt. But even in death, his legend grew. Shrines were built, statues carved, and across the Greek world, people whispered his name when illness came. As centuries passed, the whispers turned to hymns, and the shrines turned into temples. These were the Asclepia, and they weren't just places of medicine, they were centers of hope, of mystery, of quiet dread. The earliest ones were modest. Stone enclosures around sacred springs, simple altars, groves planted in his honor. But as pilgrimages increased, so did the complexity of the ritual. It began with purification, not merely symbolic, but rigorous. The sick would bathe in cold water, sometimes for days. They would fast. They would sleep outside, exposed to wind and insects, believing this suffering cleansed the soul and body. Some came barefoot from far regions, walking until their feet bled. Some brought offerings, figs, honey, clay votives shaped like the body parts they hoped to heal. Eyes, ears, knees. 1,000 tiny terracotta limbs lined the altars, each one a silent prayer. And still they waited. When the priests deemed them ready, they were led into the abaton, the sacred dormitory, where the gods might speak. This chamber was often underground or walled in thick stone, damp and cold even in summer. There were no windows, only oil lamps flickering, casting dancing shadows. The sick lay side by side, hundreds at times, some moaning, others quiet in fear or faith. And always, the snakes moved through the darkness. Non-venomous, yes, but alien. Their tongues flicked the air. They glided across feet, legs, faces. To some, it was a blessing. To others, a nightmare. The dreams that followed were unpredictable. Some awoke weeping with joy, convinced they had been healed. Others saw themselves being cut open by divine hands, entrails pulled and replaced with golden light. And some saw nothing at all, only endless corridors, endless waiting. For the priests, these visions were scripture. They interpreted them with the weight of divine authority. A dream of a dog might mean a new remedy. A dream of falling might suggest unresolved guilt. And their verdict could not be questioned. You were healed, or you were not. You were pure, or you were not. But not all Asclepia were gentle in appearance. At Pergamon, for instance, the temple was grand, austere, imposing. Pilgrims entered through a tunnel nearly 70 meters long, dark, narrow, with water dripping from the ceiling. It was meant to be symbolic, entering the womb of the earth to be reborn. But many found it claustrophobic. The air was stale, the silence total. By the time they emerged into the temple grounds, their minds were primed for anything. Suggestion was powerful. And so, when the priests offered potions, often wine mixed with herbs of unknown origin, they drank. When they were told to lie on specific stones or to press certain charms to their skin, they obeyed. And when they began to tremble or hallucinate, the priests explained it was the god moving through them. There was no room for skepticism, no other source of truth. And yet, curiously, many were healed. Not all, of course, but enough to sustain the belief. Enough to make people return. Some modern scholars suggest that the rituals themselves, the fasting, the suggestion, the symbolism, triggered genuine physiological responses. Others believe the healings were rare, and the rest was faith, placebo, or time. But for the ancient Greeks, the Asclepia were indispensable. They offered not only hope, but order. Illness was not chaos, it was a message, a test, a punishment, a chance. And in a world where death was constant, where war and plague and famine could come without warning, the idea that a god might intervene in your favor was irresistible. Still, there were murmurs. Stories passed from one traveler to another. Stories of people who never returned, of priests who demanded more than offerings, of dreams so vivid they left scars. There were tales of children brought for healing, only to vanish, of bones buried behind the abaton, of rituals gone too far. But these were just stories, weren't they? No one dared ask too loudly. The temples stood, the fires burned, and the names of the healed were etched into stone for all to see. Tonight, as we journey deeper into this world, remember, these were not hospitals as we know them. They were sanctuaries, stages, laboratories of belief. And behind every miracle, there was a ritual, and behind every ritual, a shadow. The more one explores the world of the Asclepia, the more unsettling it becomes. Beneath the carefully chanted hymns and neatly swept courtyards lay older instincts, primal fears, and rituals passed down not from written doctrine, but from something deeper, oral memory and superstition. It is tempting to think of the ancient Greeks as philosophers in togas, debating under columns in warm daylight. But for the sick and suffering, those serene discussions were far away. In the sanctuaries of healing, the language was not Socratic. It was symbolic, visceral, sacred, and often it was terrifying. When night fell upon these temples, silence took on weight. The moans of the ill grew more desperate, the shadows more pronounced. Dreams were not gentle gifts, they were confrontations. For those in the abaton, it was a test of the mind. The stone floor was cold. The snakes moved freely. The oil lamps flickered until they died. In that darkness, sound warped. A single cough echoed like thunder. Footsteps, always just out of view, tapped slowly down corridors. Sometimes the priests whispered prayers too softly to understand. Sometimes there were no priests at all, only waiting. The belief was that in this suspended state between consciousness and sleep, between fear and surrender, Asclepius would visit. But what he brought was not always healing. Ancient inscriptions speak of miraculous recoveries, yes, but they also hint at possession, voices heard in the night, visions too vivid to bear. One story tells of a woman who dreamed her heart was pulled from her chest and replaced with stone. When she awoke, her chest ached for weeks. She was deemed healed. Another, of a man who saw himself walking into the sea, never turning back. He died 3 days later. Still, his death was said to be peaceful and thus a form of healing. This ambiguity between cure and curse ran through all the rituals. There were sacred dogs kept at some temples. They were allowed to lick wounds, believed to carry divine saliva. Sometimes, the patients flinched in horror, but no one stopped it. There were plants used in potions whose effects we still debate. Some likely cause sedation, others hallucinations, and some, perhaps, silence, permanent. But the greatest fear was not always what the gods would do. It was what the priests might do in their name. The lines between faith and control blurred in these spaces. Those who questioned the rituals were asked to leave or stayed forever. The priests held power not just over health, but over fate. They decided who was healed and who was not, whose dreams mattered and whose did not, whose offerings were sufficient and whose were lacking. And their word, like the word of the god, was final. Pilgrims came in desperation, after all. They had no leverage, no authority. They came on bleeding feet. They brought their dying children. They begged, and they submitted. Some scholars today believe many of these temples functioned as early psychological institutions, places where the mind was treated as much as the body. They point to the dream therapy, the sensory manipulation, the symbolic rituals. Others argue these were theocratic theaters, performance spaces where belief created its own reality. But few deny the fear that lingered within them. Even now, at Epidaurus, visitors report unease beneath the ruins. The Abaton is closed to the public. The old stairwells are roped off. The silence there is too perfect, too still. In ancient times, people claimed they saw things at night, shapes gliding between the pillars, faces behind curtains that vanished when approached. They spoke of a weight pressing on the chest during sleep, of hands they could not see. The priests called it the presence of the god. The skeptics called it mass suggestion. But everyone agreed it was real, and not always welcome. Yet still, people came. In droves. Because even fear is better than despair. Because the unknown, no matter how terrible, is preferable to hopelessness. And because miracles, true or not, offered something no ordinary life could. A story, a purpose, an ending that made sense. And so the Asclepia remained full. The altars glowed with candles. The snakes were fed. The gods were praised. And in the quiet hours before dawn, a voice, yours or someone else's, would whisper in the dark, "Let him see me. Let him heal me. Let him come." Tonight, as we move forward in our journey through ancient medicine, we leave behind the gentle myths of heroism and intellect. What we now explore is stranger, darker, more human. It is about pain, about fear, about what people will endure, not just to live, but to understand their suffering. And in the next chapter, we'll descend even deeper, into the body, into the practice, into what passed for surgery and what it cost. The dream may be over, but the nightmare is just beginning. When most people today think of ancient Greek medicine, they imagine scrolls and scholars, the white-bearded Hippocrates standing calmly in a columned hall, reciting balanced theories about humors and balance. But those theories, so neat on parchment, were forged in blood. Greek medicine, especially when it dealt with wounds, tumors, or invasive illness, quickly became a matter of knives, saws, and risk. And those who practiced it were not philosophers. They were craftsmen of flesh. And what they did was terrifying. Surgery in ancient Greece was a strange contradiction, primitive in tools, yet often sophisticated in approach. Physicians knew how to drain abscesses, remove bladder stones, stitch wounds, and even perform trepanation, cutting a hole in the skull to relieve pressure or madness. But there were no anesthetics. There were no sterile fields, no gloves. Just sharpened bronze, a basin, and someone to hold the patient down. Imagine the moment. You are led to a room. The smell of herbs mixed with old blood. The doctor doesn't wear white. He wears brown. His apron is stained. He has done this before, and he will do it again. You are asked to lie still. You are told to bite something. A cloth, a stick, sometimes another patient's hand. If you scream, the gods will not hear. They are already watching. They are waiting to see if you will survive. The knife is heated not to sterilize it, but to make it more decisive. It enters the flesh slowly but firmly. There is no countdown, only action. Pain is not acknowledged, it is assumed. Blood pours quickly. The assistant wipes it with wool soaked in wine. There is pressure, always pressure, and the sound, flesh parting, bones scraping, sometimes cracking. The surgeon does not flinch. He is focused. To him, this is a task, not a person. A mass to be removed, a bone to be reset. You, lying there, are a vessel, and if you survive, you may thank him. If not, your name is carved on a small tablet, and life continues. Tools were many. Scalpels made of bronze and iron, bone levers to pull open rib cages, hooks to lift tendons, forceps to retrieve foreign objects from wounds, saws to amputate when rot had traveled too far. Needles, thick and unforgiving, threaded with animal sinew. There were ointments, 2 concoctions of honey, vinegar, and herbs. Some were antiseptic, others merely delayed infection. And yet, many did survive. Because the human body, despite the horror, is resilient. Because some surgeons, despite the brutality, were skilled. They had learned from watching wounds in war, from treating gladiators, from trial and agonizing error. Some had performed the same operation dozens of times. They knew where to cut and where not to. But it was always a gamble. The body could betray them. So could fever or blood loss, or simply bad luck. The temples of healing were not exempt from these realities. At Epidaurus and elsewhere, patients sometimes underwent surgery after dream revelation. A vision might say the tumor must be removed. The priest would agree, and the knife would follow. But even in cities, among the best physicians, outcomes were uncertain. There are records of surgeries that worked, of patients cured of breast tumors, hernias, dislocations, but also of screams in alleys, of massaged wounds turning gangrenous, of bones set wrongly, growing sideways, of maggots crawling from unwashed sutures. Pain was part of the price. So was silence. Children were rarely operated on. They were too fragile. Women, too, were often neglected unless giving birth. Then the attention became frantic. Childbirth was dangerous. Midwives worked with herbs and prayers. But if something went wrong, there was no recourse. A cesarean was a death sentence for the mother. Only the child might survive. And even that, barely. The Hippocratic Oath, noble in words, was rarely enforced. Ethics varied from city to city, from doctor to doctor. One might heal you out of duty, another for coin, and another for fame. Sometimes, failed surgeries were covered up, the body disposed of. The family told it was fate, that the gods had spoken, and in a culture so deeply entwined with divine will, few argued. The line between medicine and religion blurred. Physicians invoked Apollo, Asclepius, Hygeia. Some carved their successes into stone. Others prayed before each incision, and in the background always was fear. Fear of the knife, of the unknown, of waking up maimed, or not at all. But people still came, because to do nothing was worse. Because the pain had already consumed their days. Because hope, however slim, was a stronger force than despair. And because in the dark hallways of Greek medicine, even terror could be called healing if it bought one more day of breath. Next, we go deeper. Into the minds of those who performed these procedures. Into the rituals that guided their hands. Into the strange blend of science and superstition. We will follow the doctors, not as healers, but as men walking a narrow bridge between knowledge and cruelty. And we'll ask, when does medicine stop healing and start hurting? They stood in the silence of stone rooms, surrounded by the relics of the sick and the dying. Bronze tools, sharp and darkened by blood. Bowls still fragrant with myrrh and wormwood. Cloths stiff with old pus and dried fluids. These were the physicians of ancient Greece, not serene sages in white, but hardened men trained in the brutal intimacy of the human body. And more than that, they were believers. Medicine to them was never just science. It was ceremony. The lines between healing and ritual were not blurred, they were one and the same. Before many surgeries or treatments, the physician would invoke divine names. Asclepius, Hygeia, Panacea. He might burn incense, murmur a prayer, or place a small talisman under the table. This wasn't mere showmanship. It was insurance. For every cut into flesh was also a cut into fate. And fate, in their eyes, was ruled by gods. The physician was not just a technician. He was a mediator between mortal pain and divine will. He had to be fearless, but not godless. The oath to Apollo and Asclepius was real. And when a procedure failed, it wasn't just seen as poor technique. It was seen as a sign, a warning, or a punishment. Physicians were both respected and feared. A skilled one could command gifts, homes, even political influence. But failure carried risk. Families of the dead could retaliate. Rumors of malpractice spread quickly. Some doctors vanished after too many deaths. Others rebranded themselves in distant cities. Medicine had no centralized authority, only reputation, and reputation was fragile. Many physicians kept written case notes not for science, but as protection. They recorded symptoms, treatments, outcomes, and dreams, especially dreams. For in dreams, the gods revealed the truth. Some healers would not operate unless the patient or the physician himself had a favorable dream the night before. If the vision was unclear, the operation was postponed. If the dream was ominous, it was canceled. Others read omens. The way birds flew past the temple, how the incense burned, how the candle flickered. Science and superstition walked hand in hand. And that's how most Greeks wanted it. A world where reason existed but never unaccompanied. One physician might consult a scroll by Hippocrates, another might consult the intestines of a sacrificed dove. Both were accepted, both were believed. Some doctors went further. They wore rings carved with sacred animals, bathed in specific springs before each surgery, slept near the patient the night before, trying to absorb their illness like a sponge. A few even performed chants not unlike spells over the tools themselves, believing the blade remembered success or failure. These rituals didn't make them frauds. They made them human. They lived in a time when death was everywhere. When one infection, one fever, could turn a house into a tomb, and when every act of healing was also a challenge to fate. What drove a man to become a physician in such a time? Perhaps curiosity, perhaps necessity. Some were trained by fathers or uncles, others were slaves, taught to tend wounded soldiers. Some learned through apprenticeship, watching, mimicking, trying. A few were former warriors themselves. They had seen the inside of men before they ever picked up a scalpel, and what they saw haunted them. Because surgery was memory, every tendon cut, every bone reset. Every scream, it lingered. The body remembered trauma. But so did the hands that caused it. Many physicians aged quickly. They drank heavily. Some became reclusive, refusing to operate after one too many deaths. Others turned cold, efficient, detached, a necessary shield, because to feel too much was dangerous. Compassion could slow the hand. Empathy could cause hesitation. And in hesitation, people died. So they became precise, like butchers. Butchers with scrolls. Their hands were steady. Their faces, expressionless. Their words, minimal. They washed their tools in wine. They spoke only when needed. And when they cut, they did not flinch. Not because they were cruel, but because they had to be. There were stories, too, of strange physicians who whispered to corpses, who experimented on the dead in secret, who dissected criminals behind closed temple doors. These were not legends. These were men trying to learn, to understand, because Greek law forbade human dissection. It was impious. But some did it anyway, quietly, risking everything to gain knowledge. And from those shadows came understanding of organs, of systems, of illness. Yet none of it was clean, none of it safe. Greek medicine was not a shining room. It was a dim cave lit by oil lamps, reeking of blood and herbs, and in it stood men who walked a line between healer and something else. Something colder, something necessary. In the next part, we will explore what happened when these physicians failed, the aftermath, the blame, the mourning, and the rituals of death that followed. Because not every patient left the temple walking. Some never left at all. And those who remained were sometimes remembered not as failures of medicine, but as offerings. Failure was never just failure. In ancient Greek hospitals, when a patient died, it was not merely a medical loss. It was a cosmic event, a rift in the delicate contract between mortals and gods. The walls of the temple did not echo with mourning, but with tension. The physicians, trained and tested in ritual and reasoning, knew that every corpse was a message. Sometimes that message was judgment, sometimes warning, and sometimes it was silence, which was worse. The process began immediately. The body was not left to linger. It had to be removed from the sacred grounds quickly, before its stillness could disrupt the flow of spiritual energy. Assistants, often lower-ranking temple workers, would carry the deceased along designated side paths routes not used by the living. The corpse would be cleansed with wine or brine wrapped in white linens, sometimes marked with sacred oil. But that was not for the dead. it was for the living. Purification was not about compassion. It was about contamination, avoiding it, containing it, disguising it. The room where the patient had died would be scrubbed with a mixture of ashes, herbs, and salt. The tools used would be soaked in strong-smelling wine or placed in the sun for days. In some cases, they were destroyed entirely, buried outside temple grounds. Not out of hygiene, but out of fear. A failed tool was believed to carry spiritual residue, shame, sorrow, or divine displeasure. It could not be used again. The physician, too, would undergo a form of ritual cleansing. This varied from temple to temple. In some, it involved fasting for 3 days, sleeping outside the sacred enclosure, and bathing in icy water before sunrise. In others, the doctor would visit a neighboring temple to seek forgiveness from a different deity. Occasionally, a priest would publicly question the physician's choices, not as punishment, but as penance, because healing in that world was not about certainty. It was about humility. To challenge illness was to challenge the divine, and when you lost, you bowed. But not all deaths brought closure. In some regions, families demanded answers. They would return to the temple with offerings, sometimes with threats. A father grieving his child might demand the physician re-enter the dream incubation chamber to seek an apology from Asclepius himself. If no dream came, the temple was blamed. Whispers spread. "This is where my son died. They failed the gods." The sacred flame dimmed when he entered. Reputation in ancient Greek medicine was smoke visible, shifting, always one breeze away from vanishing. A healer could go from savior to outcast in days. Some temples, after a string of deaths, closed their gates temporarily. Not for repairs, but for spiritual recalibration. The priests would declare the temple unclean and ban visitors for weeks. The statues were covered, the altars scrubbed, new chants sung, offerings burned at night. The silence became an act of faith, and when the gates reopened, it was as if nothing had happened. The past buried beneath ritual, but the memories lingered. Among the physicians, among the townspeople, and among those who had watched their loved ones enter and never return. For the bodies that left didn't always return to homes. Some, particularly the poor or the abandoned, were interred in mass graves outside city walls. Others were burned, their ashes scattered near rivers or olive groves. But a few those who had died under mysterious circumstances were buried within the temple grounds, in hidden corners, not honored, eined, because their death was not seen as ordinary. It was a sign, a curse, a message left unanswered. And so their graves were not marked with names, but with warning stones etched with eyes, serpents, or the symbol of silence. The physicians who presided over these deaths often changed after. They spoke less, slept poorly. Some took pilgrimages seeking new omens. Others left medicine entirely, retreating into philosophy or religion. A few returned to temples as patients themselves, no longer healers, but haunted. The burden of failure was not light. It was a weight they carried in their hands, their dreams, their silence. And then there were the stories. Of temples where too many died, of rooms where no patient ever recovered, of physicians who began to see the dead even when the rooms were empty, whispers that the gods had turned away, that Asclepius no longer listened, that something else had taken his place. These stories were never written in scrolls. They passed from assistant to assistant, physician to apprentice. Don't work in that chamber. Never use that scalpel again. If you hear footsteps at night, leave the room. These warnings were part of the education, not found in textbooks, but burned into memory. Because ancient Greek medicine was not just about knowledge. It was about survival of the patient, of the healer, of the temple itself. The next chapter begins with the environment, the physical spaces of ancient healing, the design of the hospitals, the symbols carved into walls, the architectural choices that shaped not just the experience of care, but the psychology of fear. Because the walls were never just stone. They listened, they remembered, and sometimes they whispered back. They were not hospitals in the way we understand them. They were not halls filled with white beds and fluorescent lights, or sterile corridors echoing with footsteps and machines. Ancient Greek healing sanctuaries, Asclepia, were places that merged the physical with the divine, architecture with emotion, silence with superstition. To enter one was not just to seek help, it was to cross into a liminal space where reality bent to faith, where stone watched and remembered. Each sanctuary began with placement. The site was chosen not for convenience, but for its perceived holiness. Many Asclepia were nestled among hills, near springs, in groves where birds sang strangely or the wind whispered differently. The natural world was the first architect. Stones were laid along old paths. Trees were left untouched. Water flowed where it had always flowed. The structures emerged not as interruptions, but as extensions of the land's pulse. The outermost edge was marked by a boundary stone, a horos etched with a warning. This was sacred ground. No bloodshed, no impurity, no lies. Beyond that line, you stepped out of the polis and into myth. The first structure was often the propylon, a gateway. Massive columns, triangular pediments. Symbols of divine presence above the lintels, a coiled serpent, a sunburst, a pair of outstretched wings. As one passed through, sound shifted. The stone muffled the world behind. Birds sounded louder. Footsteps became deliberate. Breath audible. And then came the courtyard, wide, open to the sky. Olive trees lined the edges. In the center, an altar blackened with old fires. Here, sacrifices were made. Not in secret, but in routine. A drop of wine, a feather, a lock of hair, sometimes a goat. Smoke curled upward, and people watched it. If it dispersed quickly, it was a sign. If it lingered, worry crept in. Surrounding the courtyard were the abaton, the dormitory chambers. These were long stone halls with many doorways, no numbers. Inside, the rooms were bare. A bed, sometimes a small statue of Asclepius, rarely a window. The walls were thick, almost unnaturally so. They absorbed heat and sound. Once inside, patients said the air changed. Heavier, thicker. Dreams came easier. Or not at all. The floor was stone. Cool, even in summer. Candles were used sparingly. Light was not trusted. Shadows were considered sacred, better for visions. Every room had one wall that hummed faintly, not with sound, but with memory. Priests said that when enough prayers are spoken in the same direction, the stone begins to whisper back. Adjacent to the abaton was the enkoimaterion, the incubation chamber. This was not a single room, but a labyrinthine series of halls, arches, and antechambers. Only select patients entered here. Only at night. It was dark. Fragrances burned resin, laurel, myrrh. The floor was scattered with herbs. The walls were carved with messages, healed by a dream. The serpent came. Do not speak until dawn. Patients lay on sheepskins and waited. Some saw visions. Some saw nothing. But all felt watched. The priests never explained what lay beyond the farthest archway. It was not forbidden, just ignored. If asked, they would fall silent. Past that point, it was said, even the gods averted their gaze. Between the living quarters and the healing chambers lay a smaller structure, the bathhouse. But this was not a place of comfort. It was where the body was stripped of the outside world. Cold water, no soap, no privacy. The bath was both cleansing and trial. Those who flinched too much were not ready. Those who endured were watched more closely. The walls dripped not with condensation, but condensation of prayer. Patients were told to whisper their illness to the water. Tell the spring what you fear. Many said the water never felt clean. It was said the first patient's suffering lingered in every drop since. Further in, near the edge of the complex, stood the temple proper. This was the holiest space. Not everyone entered. It was guarded not by soldiers, but by absence, a threshold that even the wind hesitated to cross. Inside, the statue of Asclepius stood not always human in form. Sometimes he was half serpent. Sometimes he bore too many eyes. Sometimes he smiled. The eyes were often made of onyx or obsidian. They never caught the light. which was strange because the room was lit by an eternal flame, a bowl of oil that burned without interruption. No one remembered lighting it. No one admitted tending it. It was just always burning. The floor around the statue was littered with offerings, coins, rings, a severed braid, a baby's first tooth, a letter. They were never removed. Dust gathered over decades. Some offerings began to rot, but to touch them was unthinkable. These were debts to divinity, and gods never forget. Beneath the temple lay chambers known only to priests, scrolls, bones, a pool of water that never rippled. Patients were sometimes taken there in silence, only returned at dawn. No one asked what happened. The walls knew. The silence knew. The geometry of the Asclepion was never random. Each path turned where the stars dictated. Each room aligned to a constellation. North walls bore inscriptions. South walls bore echoes. Doors opened not to utility, but to destiny. Even the angles of the roofs were calculated not for rain, but for dreams. It was said that when the stars moved right, the temple breathed differently. Patients whispered of walls that pulsed, of statues that blinked, of dreams shared across rooms. The very layout amplified belief and fear. One could walk for hours and never find the same hallway twice. Sometimes patients vanished. Sometimes they returned changed. He sees now, the priests would say. But no one asked what had been seen. Architecture became ritual. Stone became sermon. The hospital was not just a building. It was a body. And the patient stepping inside became the blood. The next section will explore what was done inside these sacred rooms. The treatments, the tools, the silence, and the screams. There were no scalpels that gleamed under fluorescent light, no antiseptic wipes, no latex gloves, no soft-spoken doctors asking if it hurt here or there. In the ancient Greek Asclepion, healing was not gentle, it was sacred. And the sacred had teeth. The methods were older than memory and coded in ritual. When a patient first entered the treatment phase, they were silent. The priests did not ask questions. They listened to the body. They observed how the patient walked, how they blinked, how the skin reacted to cold water. They read tremors like scripture. Diagnosis came not from speech, but from signs, skin tone, breath rhythm, the way the hands twitched when left still. Some priests claimed they could feel the sickness in the air, that it clung to the patient like wet wool. The first treatment was purification. This meant fasting for days, sometimes weeks. The patient was denied food, wine, even water at times. They were told it would starve the illness. That disease fed on luxury. Some fainted, some screamed in their sleep. This was considered progress. The next step was bleeding. A priest with a curved blade made small incisions on the arm, the thigh, the back of the neck. Blood was collected in black ceramic bowls. It was never discarded. Instead, it was poured at the roots of an ancient tree that grew behind the temple. No one knew how old the tree was. No one remembered planting it. The roots were stained dark. Leaves never fell. Patients were not bandaged immediately. The blood was meant to speak to the body, to stir what lay dormant. When wounds closed too quickly, it was considered suspicious. The worst illnesses, the priest said, hid behind rapid healing. After blood came fire. Heated bronze tools were pressed near the skin not to burn, but to awaken. Patients were told to breathe deeply to welcome the pain. Pain, in this context, was sacred. It opened doors. It summoned vision. A scream was not failure, it was offering. Oils were used, but not for comfort. Thick mixtures of myrrh, pine resin, and crushed bone were rubbed into the skin. Some caused hallucinations, some induced vomiting. One in particular, made from crushed centipedes and goat bile, caused temporary blindness. This was used to treat dreams that would not come. In the darkness, it was said, the patient would finally see. The most revered treatment, however, was serpent therapy. Not metaphorical. Real serpents, non-venomous, long, smooth, were kept in stone chambers beneath the Asclepion. When summoned, a priest would bring one forth, draped around his arms like a veil. The patient lay still, eyes closed. The snake was placed upon their body. It slithered slowly, sometimes curling around a limb, sometimes resting near the heart. The belief was that the serpent was an extension of Asclepius himself, that its movement diagnosed, its stillness healed. If the snake hissed, treatment was paused. If it shed its skin during contact, it was considered a sign of complete renewal. Sometimes the snake bit. This too had meaning. It was said to extract illness through blood. The bite was never treated. The wound was anointed with ash and left to scar. Scars, in the Asclepion, were not blemishes. They were signatures, proof that the divine had touched the flesh. More invasive procedures were done deeper in the complex. Bone setting was performed without anesthesia. Limbs were pulled, cracked back into place by priests who had learned from bones, not books. For internal illness, emetics were brewed fermented herbs, moldy grains, even powdered bronze. Patients drank until they collapsed. Vomit was collected, analyzed by sight, by smell, by feel. Some priests claimed to see visions in the bile images of the future, of the illness's origin, of the god's approval. One of the darkest treatments was the silence chamber, used for those suffering from madness, visions, or unrelenting nightmares. The patient was placed in a small circular stone room with no windows. Only a single vent at the top let in light. They were left alone for 3 days. No food, no sound, just stone and the echo of their own breath. When they emerged, some had no memory of the chamber. Others came out speaking in new tongues. A few never spoke again. This was not considered a failure. It was mystery. And mystery, like illness, was sacred. Music was used too, but not in the way we think. Pipes, lyres, and drums echoed in specific patterns. Certain tones were believed to disrupt disease. Patients lay still while dissonant harmonies rang through the stone halls. Some wept. Others laughed. One man reportedly died from laughter during a healing ritual. His death was not mourned. The priest said he was cleansed completely. Women were treated differently. Their ailments were often attributed to the womb, which was thought to wander inside the body. To coax it back, warm poultices were applied to the lower abdomen, while cold compresses were placed on the head. Fragrant smoke was directed at the lower body to entice the womb back into place. If this failed, the woman was isolated, sometimes for months. Madness in women was not treated, it was contained. Throughout all this, the patient was never alone. Not truly. Priests moved silently, always present, watching, whispering prayers. They knew the walls listened. Every groan, every breath was a part of the temple's memory. No pain was wasted, no scream forgotten. The Asclepion was not designed to comfort. It was designed to reveal. And healing, in this space, meant stripping away everything fear, dignity, flesh, until only the soul remained, raw and blinking in the dark. The next part of the story will go deeper, still into the dreams. What patients saw, what they believed, and how those visions shaped the very concept of what it meant to be healed. Night fell differently in the Asclepion. It did not settle like a blanket or sigh like a breath. It dropped, sudden and absolute, pressing down on the temple like a lid over a box. This was the time of enkoimesis, the sacred sleep. And for many, it was the most terrifying part of healing. After days of fasting, bleeding, and rituals, the body was raw, the mind thin like parchment held over a flame. The priests called this the opening. Only when the self was hollow could the divine enter. The patients were led silently to the abaton, a long, low hall made of cold stone and carved silence. No light entered, no voices spoke. It was forbidden to speak once inside. Even breath felt intrusive. They lay on simple pallets of straw or folded linen. No pillows, no blankets, only their bodies, trembling with exhaustion, pressed to the sacred floor. Priests moved soundlessly between them, brushing herbs beneath their noses, rubbing bitter oils into temples, chanting in tongues no one remembered learning. The air grew thick with scent frankincense, blood, rot, and honey. Then, one by one, the patients drifted into sleep. But this was no ordinary sleep. Encoimesis was induced by plants hellebore, poppy, mandrake, and by the weight of everything they had endured. In that darkness, the body dissolved. What remained was the soul. The dreams came swiftly, vividly, like theater lit by lightning. Some patients saw God's Asclepius himself, with eyes like burning water. Others saw animals, limbs twisted into human forms, mouths that whispered secrets. Many saw their own deaths, played again and again, each version slightly different. A few dreamed of nothing at all. These patients were feared. Emptiness was a warning. The most common dream was of surgery. In it, Asclepius approached with serpent hands and opened the patient's body without pain. He removed a black shape, sometimes a spider, sometimes a bird, sometimes a child, and sewed the body closed with threads of gold. These dreams were celebrated. The patient would awake with tears and laughter. Some awoke screaming. Others did not wake at all. The priests recorded every vision. They knelt by the sleepers at dawn, listening to their half-mumbled accounts, watching how they shook, how their skin flushed or paled. They did not write with ink. They carved symbols into wax tablets. Later, these symbols were taken to the dream scribe, an elder priest who had not spoken aloud in 40 years. He interpreted through gesture alone, tapping patterns into sand, which younger priests translated, "Healing was never guaranteed. If the dream was unclear, or if the god did not appear, treatment continued. More fasting, more bleeding. Some were returned to the silence chamber. Some were forbidden from dreaming again. Their sleep was watched. If they slipped into unbidden visions, they were woken with ice water or slapped across the face. One man who dreamed of a golden wolf 3 nights in a row was exiled. The priests said the god had rejected his presence. He died in the hills 2 days later. Children who entered the abaton were handled differently. Their dreams were believed to be purer, closer to the divine, but they often wept through the night. Speaking of the man made of shadows, or the woman with no mouth, one child claimed that Asclepius crawled from her stomach and whispered, "You are the illness?" She was buried under the tree behind the temple. No marker, no name. Not all dreams ended with healing. Some ended with silence. These patients were called the kept. They remained in the abaton long after waking. They did not speak, did not eat. Just lay still, eyes wide, heart slow. It was said that they lived in 2 places at once, in the body and in the dream. They were rarely seen again. A few were chosen to become priests. Others disappeared. The most terrifying aspect of the sacred sleep was that you could not lie. Dreams revealed what you would never say aloud. Infidelities, fears, hatreds, regrets. The god saw all, and he did not forget. Some patients were healed, truly. They left the Asclepian walking straighter, smiling faintly, carrying scars that burned when they lied. Others were not, and yet they still bowed and gave thanks. Because even rejection was a form of attention. To be seen, to be judged, was to be touched by the sacred. The final rite came only after the dream was interpreted. The patient was led to a pool of water, still black, bottomless. They submerged themselves, holding their breath until pain bloomed in the chest. Then they emerged, gasping, reborn. The priests declared them clean. Not cured, just clean. They were given a small token, a stone carved with a symbol from their dream. They were told to never speak of what they saw. Some did. Those who did often vanished, claimed by fever or madness within weeks. The Asclepian did not like to be spoken of. It was not a place of memory. It was a place of forgetting, of transformation, of surrender. The next part of the story will show what happened after the return to the world, the cost of healing, and the question that lingered in every dreamer's mind. Was I healed, or was I changed into something else? The abaton did not release its visitors all at once. The moment of waking, though physical, was only the beginning of a longer departure. When the priests declared that the dream had been received and the body had endured its trials, a patient was allowed to leave the sacred halls. But walking out of the Asclepian was not like walking out of a house. It was more like emerging from a storm only to realize it had followed you. The first light of day, after weeks in the temple's darkness, felt like an intrusion. Many covered their eyes, some wept. A few turned and begged to be let back in, their voices hoarse, their hands trembling. But the priests would not allow return. Once the god had spoken, the mortal must carry that voice into the world. And so they walked slowly, carefully down the long marble steps, past the serpent column, past the sacred groves where crows gathered unnaturally close. The village below the temple, once familiar, now seemed distant, wrong. The houses leaned strangely. The sky felt thinner. People's voices rang too loudly. Food tasted of ash. Water carried echoes. Most former patients chose silence. They no longer wished to speak of the dreams. Even when pressed by family, by neighbors, by curious onlookers, they would shake their heads and say, "It was between me and the god." But sometimes the dreams leaked. In sleep, they muttered names no one recognized. In the dark, they turned to speak to shadows. One man was found in the woods behind his home, drawing the same spiral over and over into the earth with a bone. When asked what he was doing, he said only, "Trying to remember the real shape of things." Some returned with new skills. A woman who had never touched clay became a potter of uncanny talent, her vessels always glazed in red and black, each depicting scenes no one understood, limbs becoming trees, mouths stitched shut, birds crying over empty cradles. A boy who had gone to the temple sick and mute came back singing songs in an unknown tongue. His parents smiled until he began weeping blood during the full moon. These changes were both revered and feared. Some claimed the god had blessed them. Others whispered they were not the same people who had gone into the Abaton, that their bodies had been borrowed, altered, replaced. This belief was so strong that certain villages would not take back those who had visited the temple. They became wanderers living on the edges of forests, speaking only to each other, sharing fragments of their dreams like prayer. Among these wanderers, a new kind of faith emerged. Not worship of Asclepius, but of the dream itself. They believed that the dream world was more real than the waking one, that the god had shown them truth through horror. Some drew the Abaton in charcoal on stone, with doors facing inward and no exit. Others wore masks shaped like the faces they had seen in sleep, long, distorted, beautiful in the way rot can be beautiful. It was not only the mind that suffered upon return. The body bore marks as well. Some awoke with symbols cut into their flesh shapes never seen before, but burned into the skin as if by fire. Others found that their illnesses had not disappeared but changed. A pain in the stomach became blindness. A tremor in the hand became silence in the throat. Healing, it seemed, did not always mean restoration. Sometimes it meant replacement. One story, passed from temple to temple, told of a woman who returned from the Abaton with a voice no one recognized. When she spoke, dogs howled. When she slept, stones around her cracked. She vanished during a thunderstorm. Her house was found filled with feathers. Her family refused to enter. In rare cases, the dreams never ended. Patients would describe visions even while awake, seeing figures walk through walls, hearing footsteps behind them at all times. They said the god still walked with them. Some welcomed this, others went mad. The temple offered no support after departure. Once the rite was complete, the patient was no longer their concern. Healing, in the eyes of the priests, was not a service but a door. What you found on the other side was yours alone. And yet, people kept coming. Despite the rumors, despite the disappearances, the Asclepia across Greece remained full. Mothers brought children. Soldiers came with wounds. Merchants arrived with sleeplessness, with guilt, with questions too heavy for the heart. They came because the gods were real, and because sometimes, even terror is better than silence. In the next chapter, we will step back from the patients and look closer at the priests themselves, who they were, how they prepared, and what terrible things they learned in order to serve the god of healing. They were not called doctors. They were not called monks. The men who served in the temples of Asclepius were called therapeutai, attendants, caretakers, but the word had always felt insufficient. They were watchers, intermediaries, and at times, gatekeepers. To become one was not merely to choose a profession, but to abandon a self. They came young, often no older than 15, drawn by visions or called by parents who claimed their sons had been touched by the god. There were rituals, of course. The washing in cold river water before sunrise, the drinking of bitter herbs, the binding of the tongue with red thread to teach silence. And then the years began. Years of learning not medicine in the way Hippocrates would have taught it, but medicine as myth, how the liver pulsed with emotion, how dreams bled into blood, how the breath could carry voices not one's own. They memorized prayers not found in any scripture. They learned the weight of bones by holding skulls in darkness. They watched animals die slowly to understand the rhythm of fading. Not all stayed. Some fled in the night screaming. Others grew quiet and thin, walking in circles until the priests sent them away. Those who remained changed. They no longer flinched at blood. They began to hear patterns in coughs, meanings in spasms. They could tell the hour by how a wound smelled. Their initiation ended with the night in the crypt. No one spoke of what happened there. Only that if you emerged before sunrise, you were not ready. And if you did not emerge at all, your name would not be spoken again. Those who passed were marked with a serpent tattoo, hidden on the inner arm or beneath the ribs. The serpent was not just a symbol of Asclepius, it was said to be the god's shadow, always coiled, always watching. As attendants, they had no names. Patients did not know who they were. They wore identical robes, kept their heads shaved, and moved silently unless spoken to. They delivered the herbs, the instructions, the dreams. They watched the patients during their sacred sleep and recorded the movements of their bodies. Some claimed they could read healing in the twitch of a toe, but not all duties were clean. There were rites that required sacrifice of animals, sometimes of insects, but always of fear. A therapon had to kneel beside the abaton and listen to the night for hours. They had to hold the sick as they screamed. They had to open mouths and pour in oils, while the body rejected life. When the god came in dreams, it was not only the patient who trembled. The therapeuti dreamed too, and their dreams were worse. They saw not healing, but unmaking. They saw their own faces dissolving in wax. They saw serpents shedding human skins. They spoke to voices that answered from behind their own teeth. Many learned not to sleep at all. A few aged quickly. A young man of 20 might look 40 by the time he left the temple if he left at all. Most didn't. Their lives became the rhythm of sickness and prayer, of ritual and rot. They were not allowed to take wives, to have children, or to write their own names. One attendant, whose story survived only in fragments, wrote in charcoal behind a stone shelf, "He teaches us to break before we mend." Another scrawled on the underside of a patient's bed, "I have not dreamed in years. I think he dreams me instead." Some went mad. One therapon tried to dig beneath the abaton, convinced there was another level where the god truly slept. He was found dead, covered in clay, his fingers worn to bone. They buried him upright, facing the temple, so he would not forget his place. Despite the horror, some found purpose. They believed in their work, not because it cured, but because it revealed. The patients came for relief, but the attendants knew healing was not about peace. It was about change. They had watched people emerge from sleep with new faces. They had seen blind men read. They had seen barren women weep with child. They had also seen worse. But they never spoke of it. Their silence was not just obedience, it was protection. For themselves and perhaps for the world. The last lesson every therapon learned was simple. The god is not kind. He is curious. And curiosity is colder than cruelty. In the next part, we will follow one final patient's path from the moment he entered the temple to the last breath he took inside it. He came alone. No family escorted him. No servants. No coins for offerings. Only a walking stick, carved with symbols he would not explain. The attendants watched from the archway as he crossed the sacred threshold. the stone warmed by sun but shadowed by memory. He gave his name only once. Menocrates, a name that sounded too old for a man so young. His eyes were deep set, his lips dry with prayer, and though his limbs looked strong, he walked like someone hollowed from within. They took him in silence. The first night was simple. A washing. Cold river water poured over his back, his chest, his scalp. The water turned pink at his feet. No wounds, they noted. No infection. But something inside him was bleeding. On the second night, he was led into the Chamber of Echoes. There, beneath the hollow dome, he was instructed to speak his illness aloud. One word, over and over, until the walls remembered it. He said, "Absence." Again, and again, absence. The word grew heavier as it echoed. Absence. As if the room itself began to feel it too. That night he did not sleep. The attendants found him kneeling beside the abaton's outer wall, tracing invisible patterns into the ground. They said nothing. The third day, he was fed only herbs of bitter root, a honey-laced ash, a powder that turned his tongue black. He drank the milk of a white goat. He chewed petals that made his stomach seize. He spoke no words. But on the fourth night, he asked a question. "Will he take something from me?" The attendant did not answer. That night, he entered the abaton. It was cold. The kind of cold that came not from wind or stone, but from absence itself. He lay on the slab, clothed only in linen, his limbs stretched like a sacrifice. A serpent was placed beside him, coiled in sleep. The oil was smeared across his brow. He closed his eyes. The first dream was soft. A forest. Wet leaves. A child's voice calling from a distant glade. He walked toward it, and the ground pulsed beneath him. The trees wept. In the dream, he touched the bark, and it bled. He awoke screaming, but no sound came from his mouth. His eyes were wide, his hands frozen in clawed prayer. The attendant wrote, "Stage 1 complete." The second night in the abaton was different. No oil, no serpent, only a chant whispered from behind the stone wall, repeated until his breath aligned with its rhythm. He slept. This time he stood in a city, familiar but wrong. The streets were filled with people whose faces were blurred, whose mouths moved without sound. They looked at him, then through him. He reached for them, but his hands passed through their bodies like steam. He walked for hours. At last he found a well. In its reflection, he saw himself. But it was not him. His face had changed. His eyes glowed. A snake slithered from his mouth. He awoke soaked in sweat. He did not scream. He did not speak. He wept. On the third night, the god came. The dream began with silence, then light, then the sound of water dripping in an endless cavern. He stood alone on a bridge made of bone. On the far side, a figure watched him. Tall, shimmering, skin that flickered like heat above flame. The figure said only one word, "Stay." He woke up smiling. The smile did not fade. Not even after they led him back to the waking halls. Not even as he drank broth. Not even as he blinked at the sky as if seeing it for the first time. The attendants knew this look. They had seen it before. But they said nothing. They waited. 3 days passed. Menocrates did not speak. He wandered the temple, sometimes tracing the same path over and over. He would stop, listen, then continue, as if following a voice only he could hear. On the 6th day, he entered the Chamber of Echoes once more. This time, he did not speak. He screamed. One long, jagged scream that rattled the dome. Then silence. He collapsed. When he awoke, his eyes were empty. He looked at the attendants, not with fear, not with recognition, but with pity. He said, "You're not ready." They moved him to the outer garden, where patients usually rested before leaving. But Menocrates did not leave. He sat beneath the olive tree for 12 days. Birds came and perched on his shoulders. Snakes coiled at his feet. Children approached him and ran away laughing. The old women wept when they looked at him. On the 13th night, he vanished. No tracks, no body. Only the stick remained, leaning against the tree, symbols now glowing faintly in moonlight. The attendants burned the linen where he had lain. They did not speak of him again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind curled wrong, some claimed to see a man walking near the temple, barefoot, his smile too wide, whispering a name no one remembered but everyone feared. The final lesson in this chapter was not written in stone or spoken aloud. It lived in silence. The hospital did not cure. It transformed. And sometimes the transformation was not meant for the world outside. Before the gods could enter, the body had to be emptied. That was the rule. No matter who you were outside the temple, noble, pauper, soldier, mother, you arrived as a vessel, and a vessel must be clean. The priests did not speak of healing until the body had been stripped of its burdens, its meals, its comforts. The process was not gentle. It began with silence. For the first day, you were forbidden to speak. This alone was enough to unsettle most. Words were like a shield for the mind, and without them, thoughts grew louder. Whispers of fear, memories long buried. On the second day, the diet began. Bread made from barley, soaked in vinegar. Boiled lentils, never salted. Figs picked before ripeness. Goat milk left sour on purpose. You drank water infused with herbs, some calming, others designed to loosen the stomach. And when night came, you were fed a drink called kaikion, a mix of barley gruel, wine, and strange powders said to bring clarity. It did not. Most vomited within the hour. But that was the point. They wanted your body to reject everything it had known. The third day brought the purge. You were led to a narrow room, where an attendant waited with a bowl of thick greenish paste. It stank. You were told to eat it. And when the cramps came sharp, low, and relentless, you were locked inside, left with only a hole in the floor and a vessel of water. Some screamed, others cried. But the process did not end until you were emptied. Then came the bath. Not a comfort, but a scouring. You were scrubbed with rough cloth soaked in oil and ash, your skin rubbed raw until it stung. The attendants whispered prayers as they worked, repeating invocations to purge not just filth, but weakness. Those who wept were not scolded, but their tears were collected in bowls and offered at the altar. Pain is the body's confession, the priest said, and confession pleased the god. On the fifth day, you were made to fast, no food, only sips of warmed wine, diluted to dull the mind. You were told to lie in the sun, naked but for a strip of cloth, and let the rays burn away your remaining shadows. The heat brought visions, faces in the clouds, whispers in the wind. And sometimes the trembling began, a shivering that started in the fingers and moved upward. They said it was the god approaching, but others said it was the body failing. The sixth day was blood, not always, but often. If the priest saw imbalance in your color or heard weakness in your voice, they would send for the blade, a small incision on the arm or thigh, just enough to let the black blood flow. The old blood carries old sickness, they said. Let it out, or it will rot your sleep. And if you refused, they would simply wait. Hunger and heat made resistance rare. By the seventh day, most were too weak to protest. But still, the rituals continued. You were anointed with oil made from crushed flowers and animal fat, smeared across your chest and brow. You were made to chew bitter root until your tongue numbed. Your feet were washed in silence. And then, only then, were you allowed to enter the abaton. It was not a reward, it was a test, and by that time, your body no longer felt like your own. The preparation was meant to make you vulnerable, open, soft as clay. You were told that in this state, the god could mold you, heal you, or destroy you. Some patients never reached this point. Their bodies gave out during the cleansing. Their minds snapped during the fasting. One woman, a merchant's wife, wandered into the sea on the fifth night, claiming the waves called her name. Another, a boy of 15, began to eat dirt during his fast, convinced the earth would nourish him better than the priests. He died before the sixth day. His blood was never drawn. His soul, they said, was unworthy. But those who endured were changed. Not always healed, but changed. They walked slower, spoke softer. Their eyes no longer searched the world, they looked inward. And when they finally lay upon the slab in the abaton, the silence was complete. Their bodies, hollowed and trembling, waited for the god's dream. And sometimes, the god came. But more often, it was the patient who did the work. For what is healing, if not surviving the trial? The ancient Greek hospital did not offer mercy. It demanded surrender. And if your body was not ready to break, it would be broken first. Once the body had been emptied, once the screams of purging had faded and the blood had dried, the silence began. Not the ceremonial silence of fasting or prayer, but something deeper. A silence that had weight, that filled the air like smoke. You were no longer among the others. You were placed in a chamber alone, a stone cell with walls that neither echoed nor welcomed sound. No attendants visited, no candles burned through the night. There was a bowl of water, there was a straw mat, and there was the door, thick, wooden, with a small grate through which bread might be passed. But even the priest stopped speaking your name. They said this was when the soul would speak loudest, but few who endured it heard anything comforting. Most began to imagine sounds. Footsteps where there were none. Breathing from corners too dark to see. Some said they heard their own names whispered by voices they did not know. One man reported hearing he bleating of a goat beneath the floor, constant, rhythmic, maddening. No goat was found. Another claimed that his dead wife visited him each night, weeping beside the mat and begging him to leave with her. He refused. He survived, but when he finally left the chamber, his hair had turned completely white. The priests did not explain this. They only nodded, as if pleased. Isolation, they believed, stripped the layers of the soul like bark from a tree. First the outer noise fell away, then memory, then thought, until all that remained was essence, and essence could be molded. Some broke before they reached that point. There was no shame in that. But they were sent home, quietly, with no mention of the god. They had not been worthy of the dream. Others began to pray not to the gods, but to the shadows. They whispered to cracks in the stone. They offered tears to the dust. One woman gouged symbols into the floor with her fingernails. The priest said this was a sign of communion, but the symbols matched nothing known in the temple. Her sleep came with a scream, and she never spoke again. The chamber had no windows. Light came only once a day, when a priest slid open the grate and offered a cup of wine and a wordless nod. The wine was said to be mixed with herbs valerian, poppy, perhaps something else. It dulled the senses, made the walls feel soft, but it did not silence the voices. Dreams, if they came, were not gentle. Some described walking through mazes made of flesh. Others saw animals wearing human faces. A boy of 12 told of a giant seated in the stars who reached down and pulled the pain from his legs with burning fingers. He died the next night. The priests called it ascension. His parents were not informed. Those who survived the chamber often emerged different. Their eyes refused to focus. Their mouths stayed slightly open, as if still tasting something bitter. They did not rush to speak. Instead, they waited for questions that never came. For speech was forbidden for another day, and no one explained what had just happened. But the priests watched them closely. The ones who shivered uncontrollably were placed in deeper silence. The ones who laughed were deemed touched, and marked with clay on their foreheads. And those who cried upon re-entry were gently kissed by the elder priest, who whispered, "The god has seen you." Isolation was not punishment. It was surgery of the spirit. And once the soul had been carved thin enough, it could slip free of the body. Only then could it meet the divine. The Greeks did not fear madness. They saw it as a path, a crooked road to the sacred. And the hospital was not built to comfort. It was built to guide you down that road, until your footsteps no longer echoed in this world. There are tablets describing men who returned from isolation with new knowledge, herbs unknown, stars unnamed, words not taught in the temple. They became priests themselves, or oracles, or they vanished. But the memory of their stay remained in the stones. Some pilgrims reported feeling cold in the chambers even on the hottest day. Some refused to lie on the mats, claiming they heard breathing in the floor. The priests did not object. They simply smiled. For fear, they said, was the god's breath. And if you could still feel fear, then you had not yet been consumed. You were still being watched. It came without warning. The priests had said nothing that day. There had been no wine, no herb smoke curling under the door, only silence, thicker than usual, as if the very air was bracing for something. The walls did not creak. The floor did not pulse. Even the sounds of insects beyond the stone vanished. And when night fell, it did not descend, it devoured. Darkness poured into the chamber like ink from a broken amphora, swallowing the outlines of the mat, the bowl, the patient's hands. And then the temperature dropped, not to a chill, but to the breathless cold of grave soil, the kind of cold that crept into the bones and whispered, "Stay." The patient could not move. Not from fear, though fear was there, coiled tight in the stomach, but because the limbs simply would not respond. The gods, the priests had said, preferred stillness, and so still the patient remained, eyes open, but seeing nothing, mind racing, then slowing, then stretching out into a place that was not entirely inside the skull. That was when the smell began. Sweet, cloying, thick with rot and flowers, a temple offering left in the sun. It filled the chamber without entering. It bloomed behind the eyes, and with it came sound. Not footsteps, not breath, but the low, rhythmic churning of something ancient turning beneath the earth, as if the soil itself was grinding its teeth in preparation. And then a shape. No light revealed it, but the mind knew it was there. A presence pressed against the stone walls, too large to fit, but still inside. The patient's skin felt watched. Not just the face or chest, but each inch, each pore examined by something old and indifferent. The presence did not speak. It pulsed, a rhythm, slow and deep, like the beating of a heart too massive to exist. And the patient felt their own heartbeat trying to match it, trying to sync, to submit. There was no vision, no dreamscape of floating temples or celestial thrones. Only that slow rhythm and the growing sense that the body was no longer alone. Something had entered, not from outside, but from below. A whisper rose not from the ears, but from behind the teeth. "You are hollow." The voice was not sound. It was knowing. It did not ask questions. It made declarations. "You will carry me." The patient's spine arched involuntarily. The darkness pressed closer. Inside the ribs, behind the sternum, something cold bloomed. Not pain, not ecstasy, something simpler. Occupation. The god had arrived, but it was not the gentle, healing presence promised by the hymns. It was a weight, a burden, a rearrangement. The patient began to cry not from sadness, but because the body needed to do something. Tears for a life that was ending, even though breath continued. In that moment, the self fractured. The person who had entered the chamber no longer existed. A new thing blinked into awareness. Not divine, not human, something in between. Something that would be seen as blessed by the priests, but something that, in truth, was forever changed. The darkness withdrew slowly, like a tide leaving bones behind. The air warmed, the scent faded, and movement returned. The patient sat up, stood, walked to the door and waited. It would open. It always did. The next morning, the priest entered with eyes downcast. He did not speak. He offered a cup of honeyed wine and a soft cloth. The patient drank, wiped the face, and nodded. This was the sign. The visitation had occurred. The god had spoken. But what it said would never be written. Not in clay, not in hymn, not in blood. It was not meant for others. It was a private infection. A seed that would bloom in silence. And, as the patient was led from the chamber, the other supplicants bowed. They did not look at the face. They knew better. For those who carried the god bore a mark not of light, but of absence. An emptiness where a person used to be. And in that hollowness, miracles sometimes happened. But so did deaths. And madness. And the kind of silence that turned into prayer whether you meant it to or not. They emerged into the daylight not as themselves, but but as something that resembled what they had been. Faces familiar yet wrong, eyes that looked past what they once cherished. There was always applause. Not loud, not joyous measured, ceremonial, like the echo of stone cups tapped gently together. The priests would smile, say little, and declare the healing complete. The rest was silence. The newly healed were returned to their homes if they had them, to their villages if they remembered them. Sometimes they didn't. Not the names, not the faces. They'd sit on familiar stones, beside hearths once warm with memory, and blink as if seeing through the world instead of into it. Their families rejoiced, of course. At first, offerings were made, bread broken, olive oil burned in shallow bowls to thank the God who had intervened. But the days that followed were uneasy. They did not sleep, or they slept too deeply and woke screaming. Some could not bear food. Others refused to speak, not out of trauma, but as if words themselves no longer fit inside their mouths. Some forgot how to hold a cup. Others developed strange rituals touching wood before turning a corner, never stepping on shadows, whispering numbers before opening a door. And when asked what had happened, what they'd seen in that chamber, many simply stared. Not with fear, with absence. One man returned to his olive farm and refused to enter his house. He lived outside under a fig tree and drew spirals in the dirt with a stick. For months, a woman sang every night, but only in the old dialect of the island's first settlers, a tongue no one alive remembered teaching her. A child healed of seizures began to mimic animal sounds in perfect cadence and would not answer to his name. And yet, the priests called it holy. They said these were the marks of divine presence, that not all transformations were meant to be understood by mortals. The temples kept careful distance. The patients were not brought back. There was no follow-up, no inquiry. The god had done its work. Interpretation was irrelevant. Still, stories spread. Of a young man who walked into the sea 3 days after returning. Of a mother who never again recognized her child but clutched a rock as if it breathed. Of a healer healed himself, who began to carve strange symbols into every surface he passed until his hands bled and he vanished into the hills. Were these miracles? Warnings? The priests didn't say. They smiled more, bowed lower, burned thicker incense, because to question was to insult the divine, and insult could bring plague, or silence. The villagers learned not to ask. They accepted the strangeness, folded it into their prayers. They avoided the eyes of the healed, and when they spoke of the gods, they did so with mouths half closed, as if trying not to be overheard by something that listened from under the earth. Time passed. The healed lived, or existed, or lingered, and some began to show signs of knowledge they should not possess. A man blind from birth recited the names of stars only visible in winter. A girl recounted dreams of temples buried in sand carved with faces not human. A merchant, once mute, shouted in the agora about the bones beneath the city and the song they hummed when the moon was thin. He was removed, quietly. There were no temples left to house him, no chamber that could reverse what had entered, because that was the truth they dared not speak. Healing had not occurred, only change, only intrusion. And once it had taken root, it did not leave. It did not slumber. It watched through the eyes it borrowed. And sometimes, when the wind died down and the olive branches no longer stirred, villagers could feel it, just behind the air. Listening, breathing, waiting, they wore white, always. Robes that brushed the polished stone floors of the temple halls, sleeves that fluttered like wings in the breathless air. From afar, they looked like purity. Up close, they smelled of fatigue and old oil, of incense burned too long, and blood scrubbed too hard from unyielding surfaces. They were the custodians of sacred knowledge, the keepers of the god's chamber. And yet, in private moments behind closed veils and curtain-parted doorways, they whispered things to each other that no scripture recorded. They knew something was wrong, or perhaps not wrong, only older, deeper, more ravenous than belief could contain. The initiates were the first to feel it. Young acolytes, chosen for their clarity of mind and obedience, began to dream things they hadn't seen: fractured images, circular symbols, teeth where there should have been eyes. One by one, they left. Not by choice. Some fled in the night. Others were quietly dismissed, their sandals never again brushing the marble of the sanctuary. The higher priests remained, out of duty, or fear, or a quiet understanding that what they had awakened could not be returned. They performed the rituals with grace, they sang the hymns, they wrote reports to distant patrons, and said all was well. But between the lines, the truth quivered. Some began to stutter during prayer. Others could no longer sleep on temple grounds. One senior priest carved a hole into his chamber wall and claimed it was to let the air pass. But those who peered through saw only darkness that moved. There were scrolls, of course. Old ones, stored in dry chambers beneath the altar. They contained accounts of earlier days before the temple had marble, before the god had a name, back when healings were not called healings. When the sick were brought as offerings, not patients. When the term divine presence meant something closer to containment than salvation. The priests read these scrolls only once, then burned them. But fire did not erase the knowing. The chamber at the heart of the temple, the sanctuary of dreams, had no true doors, only passageways that narrowed. One priest, sent to clean its floors, returned mute. He would not look anyone in the eye. He sat in the sun for hours, head tilted slightly, as if listening to a voice that no one else could hear. And when he died, the birds refused to sing for 3 days. Another priest vanished. He had always smiled too much, spoken in riddles, insisted that the god was hungry, not holy. He left behind a robe folded neatly in the shape of a man, and beneath it, a stone carved with unfamiliar runes that bled when touched. They stopped sending people in alone after that, always in pairs. But even then, one would often emerge. Changed, distracted, glassy-eyed. The other would speak too quickly or not at all. One night, during the festival of Hygeia, a priest stood at the altar and proclaimed loudly that they were not healing, but feeding. That the chamber was a mouth, and they had lined its teeth with incense and prayer. He was removed. Not punished, not condemned, just removed. No one spoke of him again. The hierarchy maintained its form. Offerings were accepted, processions conducted. But the fear thickened. It pressed against the columns, seeped into the mosaics, hummed beneath the chants. A few tried to leave, travel to distant islands, disappear into anonymity. But they were followed, not by men, by dreams, by signs, birds that flew backward, fire that burned blue, children who spoke their names without introduction. One such priest drowned himself, not in the sea, but in olive oil. His body was never found, only the oil, turned black, still as glass. And so the rest stayed, because there was nowhere else. No temple without shadow, no god without cost. They remained white-robed, hollow-eyed, devout not out of belief, but out of survival. They had seen too much, knew too little, and feared what might happen if they ever stopped. They were never supposed to lie there. The priests, the servants, the keepers of the rites. They were the hands that washed the sick, not the sick themselves. They were the voices that sang the invocations, not the ones who needed to be called back. But time wore at the body, and what the god required, it took from everyone. There came a moment always in silence, never in public, when a priest would stumble during a hymn, or drop a bowl of sacred water, or weep during a ritual without knowing why. That was the moment the others knew. They were no longer a guide. They had become a candidate. The transition was quiet. They were not carried in with ceremony like the villagers. No hymns for them, no candles, just a short nod. A robe removed, a cold stone floor beneath bare feet. And the walk always barefoot into the chamber, the one with no true ceiling, only darkness that refused to rise. The walls were the same, the bed the same, but it was different now, because the priest knew what came. They had watched it, heard it, felt it in the bones of others, and now that silent watching would be turned upon them. Their breath slowed, not from peace, but from dread so thick it numbed the chest. They would lie still, eyes open, waiting, hoping perhaps that it would be quick, that the visitation would be kind. But it never was. Not for them. Because the god did not forget. The god remembered those who had dared to learn, who had whispered doubts even behind stone walls. The punishment for knowledge was precision. They came to the priests with clarity. No illusions, no metaphor. They showed them what lay beyond the veil, not in symbols, but in detail. Every vein of shadow, every loop of tendril, every shape that hunger could take. Some priests screamed, but not loudly. It was the kind of scream that curled behind the teeth, that bled from the ears, that left the body intact and the mind flayed open. Others laughed. A quiet, wheezing laugh, like a bag with a hole, deflating with each breath. And a few, the rare few, said nothing. They simply stood up in the morning, folded their sleeping cloth, walked to the courtyard, and stared into the sky until the birds avoided them. After their return, if one can call it, that they were changed, not mad, not broken, just not in there. Their eyes tracked nothing. Their hands moved too slowly. They would speak when spoken to, but the answers were never right. "What is your name?" someone once asked. "Seven," the priest said. "No, your name." "Seven is the name," he replied. "I remember the others, but they are sleeping." These priests were not sent away. Where could they go? Instead, they were placed in rooms with thick curtains, fed soft food, allowed to walk only when the sun was high. They became reminders, living relics, proof that the god did not forgive. The younger priests learned from them, learned what not to ask, what not to think, how to perform the rites without letting the mind wander. One priest, desperate to be healed from a fever that would not pass, begged his brothers to let him lie in the chamber. He said he believed, that he trusted, that he would return stronger. They allowed him. And in the morning, he did return. Taller, thinner, his eyes gone, just skin, stretched smooth where vision used to be. And yet he walked with no hesitation. He served for 3 more years, until one day he vanished. The floor of his room was wet, smelled like copper. No blood, no struggle. Just a circle burnt into the stone, and in the center a feather that did not belong to any bird. And so they stopped allowing the priests to lie there. Not officially. The rule was never written, but understood. They were to serve, not to submit. But sometimes, when one grew too weak, too tired, too hollow, they would go anyway. At night, alone, without asking. Those were the ones who were never seen again. And that was mercy. For it was the ones who came back that taught the others how truly unforgiving healing could be. It began with silence. Not the sacred silence of the Abaton, not the breath-held stillness of a supplicant waiting for a vision, but a different kind of quiet, a hollow one, a silence where voices once echoed, where sandals scraped stone floors in endless rhythm, where prayers rose like incense daily, hourly, faithfully, and then less, fewer steps, fewer prayers, fewer offerings left at the base of Asclepius's statues. The animals noticed first. Cats that once slinked between columns vanished. Birds stopped nesting in the sacred groves. The rodents, ever shy, became bold, emerging in daylight to scavenge fruit that was no longer taken. Then, the merchants who supplied the temple hesitated to make their deliveries. The wine came late. The oil, thinner. The incense was no longer fragrant, but damp and crumbling. And then the people stopped bringing their sick. A few still came, those who had nowhere else to turn. The desperate. The dying, but the long lines that once curved down marble steps were gone. The bath basins remained full for days. The sleeping mats were unwrinkled. The god had not changed. The rites were still performed. But something had shifted. Not visibly, not publicly, but deeply. In the soul of the city. Rumors began to spread, not in the marketplace, not in the agora, but in whispers carried on wind and woven through weaving houses. Stories of patients who entered and never returned. Of dreams that did not end at sunrise. Of priests who stared at walls long after the ceremonies were over. Of a shape, tall and winged, that watched from the corner of a chamber long sealed. The scholars tried to counter it. They wrote scrolls, held lectures, explained that the temple's power came from centuries of service, of healing, of divine presence. But their words sounded forced, as though even they no longer fully believed. The children were the first to voice it aloud. "I don't want to sleep in there," one boy said, pointing at the Abaton. "There's something wrong with the dark." His mother slapped his hand down but said nothing. She didn't sleep that night, and the next morning, they left. Just disappeared. Their home shuttered. Their name scratched off the registry. This happened again and again. Families gone, no announcements, no funerals, just absence. And the absence became louder than any proclamation. One night, the fire in the sacred brazier went out. No wind, no storm. It simply extinguished. The priest in charge of relighting it stood frozen for hours. And when he finally moved, he took off his robe, placed it gently beside the ashes, and walked barefoot into the hills. He was never seen again. That was the moment the high priest knew. The temple was ending, not in destruction, not in violence, but in abandonment. A slow crumbling, not of stone, but of certainty. And so the scrolls were burned, not all at once, quietly, one by one. The most dangerous ones first, the records of what the god had shown. The diagrams. The accounts of those who returned, not healed but changed. The logs of priests who no longer remembered their own names. Then the stories. The ones written in the margins. Descriptions of shapes without names. Sounds that made men forget their mothers. Dreams that bled into waking. Finally, the histories. The praise. The miracles. Because even those, by now, sounded like warnings. The fires burned for weeks. The smoke smelled like sage and salt. And still, the people did not return. The final offering left at the temple gates was a child's toy, wooden, hand-carved, shaped like a bird. It was broken, and beneath it, a note. No name, just 5 words. "He came in the dream." The priest stopped speaking after that. They still lived there, still tended the stone. But they no longer welcomed, no longer healed, no longer asked for anything. They waited. For what? No one knew. Perhaps for the god. Perhaps for silence. Perhaps for the last candle to gutter out. And then even the stars would look away. It didn't crumble all at once. No temple ever does. Stones do not fall together. They resist. Walls do not shatter. They lean, sigh, and give. And so it was with the last of the healing temples. The columns, once proud and whitewashed, began to yellow. Moss traced the cracks like veins. Birds returned, but not the doves of Asclepius. Crows, black-feathered, silent watchers. The pool of sacred water, where patients once bathed before sleep, dried unevenly, leaving behind a film of something iridescent. Children dared each other to step into it. None did. The temple dogs, who once guided the sick, now howled at nothing. One by one, they disappeared. The city did not notice. It had already turned its face elsewhere. New gods were rising. New medicines. From lands farther east. Elixirs in clay jars. Dusts wrapped in parchment. Midwives with herbs that didn't require dreaming. The temple doors, once open all day, were closed. First for cleaning, then for repairs. Then just closed. No one remembered who locked them, only that they stayed that way. The priests no longer left the grounds. Their sandals rotted where they stood. Their hair turned white, then fell. They spoke only to each other, and then, not even that. Eventually, even their names were forgotten. New generations grew up knowing only whispers. They knew the hill was cursed, that trees grew twisted there, that birds avoided its shadow, that the wind changed when you stepped too close. Parents warned, "Don't play near the columns." No one explained why. When asked, they grew quiet. Because somewhere, deep in the oldest memories of this city, there remained stories of people who entered and did not return, of dreams that grew teeth, of a god that had listened too closely, and those stories were heavier than stone. 1 century passed, Then another. The city changed. Roads rerouted. Markets shifted. The temple disappeared beneath vines. Earth pushed up through marble. Rain carved stories from the walls. One day, a traveler found a statue's head half buried in moss. He uncovered it, brushed the dirt away, and gasped. It had no face, not worn smooth, as if it had never had one. He left it where it was, walked quickly, told no one. Later, a scholar from another land stumbled upon the ruins. He found strange symbols etched into the back wall. They were not Greek, not Roman, not from any known tongue. He copied them into a scroll, brought them back to his university. The scroll was lost in a fire. No one could remember what the symbols looked like, only that they made the room feel colder. No one went back. Eventually, the temple passed into myth. Children called it the place where no birds sing. Teenagers dared each other to spend a night near its edge. Most refused. A few tried. None ever reached the inner courtyard. One returned with white hair. He never spoke again. The rest forgotten. The city council debated demolishing the site to build a garden. The vote passed, but the workers never arrived. Tools were misplaced, stone cracked before being touched. Eventually, the project was abandoned, the records lost. Bureaucracy forgot. The temple remained, in silence. One evening, a historian writing a book on ancient medicine asked an old woman if she remembered hearing of the healing temple. She stiffened, looked away, then whispered, "We were told not to speak of that place." The historian asked why. The woman only said, "Because something still listens." That night the historian crossed the city to see the ruins for herself. She found them, pale, glowing under a gibbous moon, windless, still, a faint scent of oil and blood in the air. She stood at the gate, then turned around, and never wrote the book. Some temples end in fire, others in flood, but the Temple of Healing ended in memory, a memory too heavy to carry. And so it was buried, not by earth, but by silence. The earth had swallowed most of it. Roots cracked the marble. Ivy curled through sacred doorways. The sky above the sanctuary had changed. Clouds moved faster there, as if winds feared to linger. The wind itself made no sound as it crossed the overgrown stones. Deep beneath the surface, where the oldest parts of the temple once breathed with incense and candle smoke, a chamber still remained. It was circular, windowless, carved into the bedrock, not built. Its walls were not of stone, but of something older, something that shimmered faintly when no light touched it. The floor was unbroken, smooth and cold. In the center lay a basin, empty, dry for centuries, but its scent remained. A mixture of herbs, blood, and something else like breath exhaled by something sleeping. Dust coated every surface, except for one, a small, flat slab. Upon it, a single object rested, a mask, the kind priests once wore during rites. But this one had no eye holes, no mouth, just the shape of a face, stretched too long, as if it had heard too much. Beneath the mask, something pulsed, slowly, not a heartbeat, not exactly, but a rhythm, faint, relentless, as though the temple itself had never truly died. From above, water had begun to seep in, drop by drop, each echo louder than the last. The chamber did not react, it waited. It had always waited. In the city above, no one remembered what had once stood on that hill. The name of the temple had vanished from maps, scrolls, memory. Even the air avoided forming its syllables. Tourists walked nearby and turned without knowing why. Children cried if brought too close. Dogs refused to follow, but still, beneath it all, that room remained, intact, preserved by silence and darkness and memory that had no shape. In time, even historians gave up. Other ruins were easier, safer, more willing to be known. This place did not want to be known, it only wanted to remain. In the end, a single monk visited, old, blind. He walked with purpose, unafraid. He had dreamed of the chamber for decades. Not visions, not nightmares, just invitations. He reached the outer stones, passed through arches cracked with time, climbed steps half swallowed by moss, and descended, deeper, past layers of forgotten things, until he stood in the room. He did not flinch, did not speak, simply sat before the mask. Hours passed, then days. He never moved. Until, finally, he lay down, as if in sleep, as if in trust. The mask did not move, but the room grew quieter, as if listening, as if content. Outside, nothing changed. The wind still avoided the hill. The roots still broke stone, but something in the earth grew stiller, less hungry, as if the temple had been given what it needed, and now, at last, could rest. Not peace, but something close, something ancient, and forgotten, and still.